But when your boundaries are observed, you setting boundaries is observed by a narcissistic person, they will likely tell you that you're being controlling. And obviously, that's a bit of a projection. Today, the term we're going to talk about is boundaries. But as always, before I get to that, I always welcome you to please hit the key here to subscribe to this channel, hit the bell to get notifications, and that will keep you abreast of, actually, we're putting out more content than ever, let you know new content when it comes out to get that notification. So let's talk about boundaries. So let's start with a question. What is a boundary? You think about it, it's a fence, it's a border, it's a wall, it's a fortress. But I'm talking about psychological boundaries. And since we're talking about a psychological concept, those things are metaphors. But what do they really mean? What does it mean to have boundaries? It's sort of the major psychological buzzword of our time. But the fact is, a lot of people aren't always clear about what boundaries are. Psychological boundaries are sort of rules. In their simplest forms, these could be rules about appropriate times to call someone or text someone. Or are you allowed to just show up at their house, or do they expect you to call first? And they make that clear. It can be the kinds of topics you talk about. Politics, or some people may view sex as an unacceptable or uncomfortable topic and feel that to talk about your sex life would be violating a boundary. Boundaries around other kinds of language may also exist. For example, sharing information about a salary or a bank balance may be considered violating a boundary. But boundaries can also be physical, and that could be things about whether you hug someone when you greet them, how close you sit to them, whether you can touch them in any way whatsoever, whether you were to sleep in a bed next to them, whether you would ever dream of sharing a bed with them. But these are sorts of easy boundaries to understand when they're physical, or words people say. You can see them, you can hear them, and in that way, you can govern them. But boundaries get a lot more complicated when it starts getting into subtle psychological territory. A nonverbal gesture may feel uncomfortable for someone. A topic that to many people may seem normative may actually feel traumatic or offensive for other people to talk about. It may even relate to the volume or pitch of your voice or the tone of your voice. So in a way, boundaries can feel like rules, like having to stop at a stop sign, or wait in line at a store, or saying please and thank you. Those are easy rules to understand that get communicated by, signs hanging on the wall, like, for example, a sign saying wait in line, or laws that tell us if you don't stop at a stop sign, you're going to get a ticket, or by society telling us we need to say thank you and please as a part of basic manners, and they're really clear. But that doesn't mean that people always follow even those rules. Now, not following those rules can result in some form of penalty, a fine or a social disapproval, but the rules are clear. Our psychological boundaries aren't. We don't have signs in our homes or signs taped to our foreheads listing what we consider to be appropriate boundaries. So it all becomes an interesting dance. When someone violates those boundaries, whatever they are, we can tell them, and ideally in a healthy relationship, they will acknowledge those boundary violations and shift the behavior. But think about it. How many times when someone has violated or stepped on a boundary of yours, did you really communicate clearly with them at the time they made the boundary violation? So many of us have been socialized or learned over time to keep quiet, to work around it, to not make such a big deal about it. And then it means that our boundaries may get violated over and over and over again. But we don't feel empowered to try to change the situation. We just don't feel like we have permission to do so. And we may not have been given the skills to do so. Now, for some things, like a person giving too many details than you want to hear about a one-night stand, we may be able to shrug it off and say, ugh, whatever. But what about the bigger ticket stuff? For example, when a person speaks poorly or negatively about issues or people or aspirations that we care dearly about, or when a person keeps foisting more work on you little by little by little, either at work or at home, or when a person keeps baiting you and gaslighting you and manipulating you, that starts to get into much more complicated territory of this complicated issue called boundaries. This isn't just about turning your phone off at 9 p.m. or telling people to not call you. So here is where boundaries get really tricky. We cannot control other people. We can only manage ourselves. Many times people do not agree or respect the boundaries we have, yet they may still talk about their uncomfortable topics. They may keep baiting us. They may keep invalidating us. And they may keep saying and doing inappropriate and disrespectful things. What do we do then? The rules of the world at large work because there are often real consequences that follow when those rules get broken. The same thinking, though, could be applied to boundaries. Maybe that people would change their behavior if there were real consequences. But that gets tricky in the world of narcissism. For a start, narcissists and difficult personalities usually don't follow rules. They often don't even follow the laws. And they generally don't believe rules apply to them. Their entitlement, grandiosity, and arrogance all mean that they believe rules are for other people, and they flout those rules and get really enraged when they are held to the same standard as everyone else. And in fact, I am a firm believer that the myriad nitpicky rules and laws our society is required to have largely come down to having to keep the narcissist at bay. The rest of us are willing to play by the rules because, in fact, we respect the people around us. So if they aren't willing to follow rules and laws, do you really think that they're going to respect your personal boundaries, especially given their contempt for relationships? Probably not. So our unwillingness or our inability to set boundaries with narcissists results in all of us enabling them. Just like when they run the stop sign, over time, the tickets and the penalties may stop them from doing it, not because they believe they should have to stop at a stop sign, but because they don't want to pay a fee. They don't even believe they have to pay, but they want to keep driving. But most of us don't set boundaries like that with narcissists. Why not? Why do so many of us have so much trouble setting boundaries with narcissists? For reasons that are both understandable and also difficult. For one thing, many of you may not fully understand narcissism and actually believe that all people will hear you when you tell them something, or they'll register the hurt feelings on your face, or they will be able to benefit from social cues and catch themselves. Nope. That is not happening with narcissistic individuals, ever. They are not able to self-govern. They are not able to self-regulate. So that is not an option. Secondly, many of us are uncomfortable with conflict. And add to that the fact that many of us have our own struggles with being enough and even feeling like we have the right to set and enforce our own boundaries. We gaslight ourselves and may say, maybe I'm being too sensitive. Maybe it's not that big a deal. Maybe it's me. Maybe I just need to learn to compromise. Third, you may be so accustomed to poor boundaries from your families of origin that the concept of setting boundaries literally feels foreign to you. And if you did try to do it in your family, you would have been unheard, unseen, mocked, and the boundary violations would continue or maybe even get worse. In addition, for those with histories of trauma, particularly early life trauma, physical, sexual, or other abuse during childhood, setting and maintaining boundaries becomes an even greater struggle because those boundaries were violated in such a profound way, and the concept of boundaries can remain confusing. trauma work addressing this becomes absolutely essential. And with narcissists, the sad issue becomes that even if you push through all of these barriers and communicate appropriately, communicate directly, and communicate clearly, it probably won't work. Remember that they don't even want to stop at the stop sign or wait in the line at the coffee shop. They already devalue you. Do you really think that your boundaries are going to be heard by them? Probably not. And that is where it gets really toxic. It may have taken superhuman effort, therapy, anything you could have done to even summon up the courage to talk about boundaries. Or you may actually be good and able to talk about boundaries and actually did it and saw that very little changed. And in fact, the narcissist became quite defensive, and then they turned the entire conversation back on you with lots of gaslighting, manipulation, and other abuse. Many therapists do not build an understanding of narcissism into their work with those living in narcissistic relationships. So the guidance to set and enforce boundaries is just really mental health common sense. But telling you to set boundaries with a narcissist is like throwing you into a cage with a tiger. When your attempt to set or enforce boundaries with a narcissist, and these can be simple boundaries, very simple, like things like, could you please not use your phone when we are eating dinner? There are also maybe very nuanced boundaries. Please don't compare me to my mother, given the trauma of that relationship to me. When all of that fails, you are now thrown into a place characterized by helplessness, hopelessness, and powerlessness. You may feel that maybe you didn't do it right, or maybe it was your fault, you weren't clear enough, or maybe you are being too sensitive. And again, it's more and more of the self-gaslighting. And then the boundary violations persist because you may simply not understand what you're dealing with when you're dealing with a high conflict narcissistic partner. And it's in this way that over time, even when other people tried to set boundaries with the narcissist, it didn't work. The healthy or fortunate people were able to walk away from the narcissist once they recognized that their boundaries were not respected. But the fact is, most people don't do that. And over time, they stop trying to enforce boundaries with the narcissist. And in that way, slowly, more and more people enable the narcissist because they can't be bothered with even taking this on with them. So this dynamic is particularly prevalent in family systems in which a parent does not honor boundaries. Because as a child, it is all but impossible to enforce boundaries with a parent. And none of the other adults around them they can't enforce boundaries with them either. And this is a theme that is observed in what we often traditionally term more codependent family systems. These family systems are governed by fear of the narcissist's reaction, fear of the narcissist's anger, and fear that the narcissist will devalue and discard them. In this way, narcissists do a great job of weaponizing boundaries. They pathologize you. They paint you as being crazy for wanting them. And they foster fear through their anger and their reactivity, which results in an even lower likelihood that people will consistently set boundaries. And then it can escalate the overall trauma bonding of the narcissistic relationship systems, whereby people defend and enable so they can avoid having to dismantle. Now, boundaries in the workplace are a major issue when you're dealing with workplace narcissists. Workplace narcissists and managers and supervisors violate boundaries in a whole range of ways. They ask you to work longer hours, and sometimes they'll ask you to do that without compensation. They'll give you responsibilities outside of your job description. They may ask you to do things at work that are not in line with the job. So for example, picking up their laundry or researching a vacation for them. maybe even sending their mistress flowers. And those requests violate a personal boundary. They may ask inappropriate questions of your personal life, or it can veer into even more oppressive and toxic territory with sexual harassment, inappropriate advances, and even stalking. Obviously, these boundary violations exist on a spectrum. When you have narcissists in the workplace, they will violate boundaries. It's not will they will. They are sort of the sloppy drunks on business trips. And they're the reason we all have to complete these online trainings about very ridiculous fundamental pieces of human interactions. Most of us understand boundaries, they don't. Boundary violations in the workplace are one of the primary ways that workplace narcissists reveal their narcissism and their abuse and their harassment. They will typically gaslight when they're called out on their boundaries. So, I was just having fun with you. In this new era, you can't even make a joke. Come on, everyone does a little extra to get ahead. It's called ambition. In the era of Me Too, ironically, you would think that this would have slowed some of this down. Interestingly, it has resulted in narcissistic individuals being even more contemptuous of boundary setting. Work isn't fun anymore. It's impossible to be able to talk with people anymore. It's as though they are not able to navigate a world with appropriate boundaries, so they reject it and they ridicule it. In the workplace, it is essential that you document everything. This is tedious, but it's necessary. If narcissists and other toxic colleagues and managers are behaving inappropriately, a record of this, ideally in sort of two-party sources like emails, voicemails, etc., are essential for human resource or legal advisors to act on anything. Unfortunately, your first-person report is not going to suffice. And even with the documentation you provide, you will be amazed at how often the narcissist will still prevail in these situations. Another tool is to have firm boundaries from the jump. This isn't easy for all of the reasons I already mentioned, that people feel like they don't want to be the wet towel from the jump, and they want to be able to engage in the workplace banter. Some people may even be confused by the poor boundaries. It can feel like if they're on the receiving end of these poor boundaries that they may be sort of the favored child in the workplace or getting special opportunities. But then you realize it doesn't feel good. But in these ways, you can slowly acclimate to a setting that has confused boundaries and then very quickly find yourself in more problematic situations. Other boundary setting in the workplace might involve things like avoiding solo meetings with the narcissist when you can, avoiding meetings that involve alcohol or other inappropriate settings for meetings, such as, for example, private hotel rooms, asking for meetings to be recorded. You should ask for meetings to be recorded or detailed minutes taken. And it's important to keep copies of your work in hard copy for your records, because if there's any doubt about your contributions, you'll need that. Boundary violations are, in fact, one of the primary ways that workplace narcissism does its damage. Workplace narcissists are enabled by the yes men and yes women and sycophants and people who are afraid of killing the golden goose or of angering a terrifying boss. Just like in a family where the narcissistic parent is enabled, the same dynamic happens in the workplace. And that is precisely how the mailroom tyrant can get promoted all the way to being the CEO tyrant. The fear that they generate is equated with power and strength. And the fear of calling them out on their boundary violations means that people enable them, shut up, or leave the job. So what do? You certainly can't live without boundaries, but you have to become realistic about them if you are in a narcissistic relationship. First, and always, you need to practice rule number 1 of narcissistic relationships. You have to have realistic expectations. Unfortunately, narcissistic individuals do not integrate feedback from other people well, least of all when it can be perceived as any kind of criticism, which is just about any kind of feedback that they receive. For long-term narcissistic relationships that you've been in, you then realize that your feedback is not going to help, and they are not likely to change that much. If this is a new relationship, a new territory, then you need to be prepared that they will not honor your boundaries. So it may be a red flag to get out and cut your losses and step away from the relationship. Second, you need to use these expectations to set a different kind of boundary. Stop engaging and sharing important things about yourself. Don't share your feelings. Don't share your emotions. Don't share your aspirations. Don't share your negative moods. Don't share much with a narcissist. Basically, yeah, go gray rock. In so doing, it becomes less about you waiting for them to honor a boundary, but instead it becomes about you setting one for yourself that you can honor and enforce. It isn't easy in the beginning, and over time, you start to realize that this isn't really much of a relationship. Some people may recognize this as the point to leave a relationship, that it's completely empty, while others may recognize that they cannot be their authentic selves in the relationship, and while they may not be willing or able to leave the relationship, they may instead to choose to cultivate other sources of support. The bottom line is that the boundary is something you set for yourself. You don't share, you don't engage, and you don't take their bait, and you sure as heck don't wait around and wait for them to actually honor your boundaries. So why do narcissists have such a difficult time with boundaries? Arrogance, entitlement, impulsivity, poor self-reflective capacity, lack of empathy, grandiosity. Short answer, the rules, they think they don't apply to them. They want to do what they want to do. And then after they have their impulsive acting out, sometimes they apologize. They are poorly regulated and impulsive. So they will often violate a boundary, do what they want to help them regulate their negative mood state at a given time. Their poor self-reflective capacity means that they're not able to take a moment to think about how their actions or words are impacting other people. And then there's the issue of shame. Shame is actually a very interesting consequence for narcissists. When they violate boundaries, there may sometimes be a public reaction. The family gets mad at them, a workplace supervisor takes action, they have to face a lawsuit, and then they feel their narcissistic version of bad. They feel ashamed. Now you would think that would mean that they would stop the boundary violating behavior, but unfortunately, that's not how shame works for them. Instead, it drills down into the most self-loathing parts of the narcissist, and it creates a sense of self-anger that they project out into the world, and then they violate even more boundaries from a place of contempt and a place of anger at themselves that they project onto the world. It's a sad dynamic, but it often plays out this way. Now, boundary setting is considered to be one of the most useful strategies with a narcissist, but also one of the most frustrating. They will not honor them, and enforcing the boundaries is a futile pursuit. But the boundaries still remain important. In the extreme, laws do sometimes stop narcissists. They don't want to go to jail. They may violate a boundary, which is also breaking the law, like trespassing or carrying a gun someplace they should not be carrying a gun, or pushing a person physically who doesn't let them cut ahead in a line. And then law enforcement gets called, and maybe they get arrested. Probably not, because they talk themselves out of it. And maybe they go to the jail. Probably not. But that's a real consequence. Now, interestingly, you would think that fear of jail or prison would shape their behavior in the future. Not as a rule. Prison is not a treatment for narcissism. And once a narcissistic individual comes out of prison, the narcissistic patterns remain. They may even be worse. They also will sit there and view themselves as a victim of an unfair system and will keep breaking the rules and violating boundaries. And I can say with some confidence, it may literally be impossible to have a narcissist maintain appropriate boundaries. When it comes down to it, they are limit-testing children who always try to stay up 1 minute later than bedtime. And everyone needs to be clear on their personal non-negotiable boundary. We all have one. For some people in a relationship, it might be, for example, cheating or infidelity. For others, it might be someone stealing money from them. For others, it may be physical violence. Everyone has their non-negotiable. And if the narcissist crosses the non-negotiable line, then people may actually feel more empowered to do the ultimate boundary drawing and get out. But again, the idea of creating boundaries that the narcissist is going to honor on a regular basis is ridiculous. It's on us to manage our boundaries. And the ways we can manage those boundaries is to not engage, not have idle banter with them, to not spar, and to not render ourselves vulnerable. So it is on us. We have to be our own gatekeepers. We have to protect our own boundaries, and we have to value ourselves enough and our boundaries and our limits enough to respect our boundaries for ourselves and give ourselves permission to disengage from toxic and difficult people who will never respect our boundaries. And in so doing, boundary setting can stop feeling like a frustrating and hopeless endeavor, but instead, it can feel like a lesson in empowerment and the fact that the most powerful boundary you have is to simply not engage with someone who is not good for you. I'm really going to take on the issue of why boundaries are so hard to set in narcissistic relationships. So before we get to that, please come on over and subscribe to this channel. And then hit that bell to get notifications every time we put out new videos, which is several times a week. So let's break this down. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm always making this suggestion to you, but I'm aware that it's not so easy. So why are boundaries so hard to set, especially for people who are in any kind of narcissistic relationship? I know that some of you hear this guidance, or many of you hear this guidance, not just from me, but from everybody who talks about toxic relationships, that one of the most important tools in managing narcissists is boundaries. Honestly, it's one of the most important tools in life. But if you can master that, then you got your narcissist all figured out. So if it's so simple, then why is it so difficult? There are two simple reasons that boundaries are so hard to set. And interestingly, they are also part of the reason you got stuck in a relationship with a narcissist in the first place and why you remain stuck in it for a very long time. What are these two reasons? Number one, you are worried about other people's reactions and what other people will think if you set a boundary. Your fear is if you set a boundary, people will not like it. They're going to think that you're not a very nice person. Even the people in your life who are not narcissistic. Let's view it simply. In the most simple version of a boundary, what is it? It's about saying no. It's about not giving in. It's about not giving up too much, not agreeing to something you cannot do, not agreeing to something that makes you uncomfortable, not overextending. Think of the last time, really, think about the last time you set a boundary. Share it in the comments if you want. What was that boundary about? I know for me that the most recent boundary I had to set was a few days ago, and I had to say no to something. It was very uncomfortable. And I know I let someone down. But on that day, I happened to be exhausted, and I knew I was kind of burned out. And the person asking me of this thing I needed to do was incredibly entitled. Did I sit with this discomfort for a few minutes? Yeah. And after about 30 minutes, that discomfort left. I was relieved and I had a better day as a result. But in my case, it was easier because there was no one else who knew I was setting the boundary. When there's other people involved, it's really hard. The other issue is not just feeling like you're letting down one person, but again, it's that bigger idea of how will other people view you. There is often the concern that other people will either view you as lazy, or as a flake, or as not a team player, or just that anxious feeling that people are not going to like me because I set a boundary. That concern that you will be judged harshly is why so many people keep giving in to doing too much, usually for the toxic people who just keep asking for more. There is an ancient quote by Lao Tzu who said, "Care what other people think, and you will forever be their prisoner." That quote could not be more true when it comes to setting boundaries. We are never fully going to live in a world where we never care about what other people think. But we tend to put too much importance on that when it comes to boundary setting, and then we don't end up setting the boundaries. And finally, because so many people out there feel like they are not enough, they just keep doing and doing and doing for other people, thinking that there's a point they could reach where they'll feel like they're enough. They can fix that. It's never enough for other people, especially for narcissistic people. So feeling like you're not enough, that's on you to address. Doing stuff for other people ain't gonna address that. The big issue here is that these very qualities in ourselves, are caring too much about what other people think, being afraid of letting other people down, feeling like you have to keep rescuing or doing stuff for other people, feeling like you're not enough, not liking the feeling of letting other people down, is literally exactly part of what made you so vulnerable to a narcissistic relationship, and perhaps found it so hard to get out, or maybe you're still in it. Toxic people take and take and take. They don't have the empathy to care. They're deeply entitled, so they're never going to stop and take stock and wonder if they are asking too much of someone. In fact, it's more likely that they simply view you as a convenience, an object to fulfill their needs. So they aren't going to wonder if they are asking too much of you. And if you care what they think and never set a boundary, then you will be living life as a bottomless well that keeps serving their needs. You're the only one who can stop this cycle. That's a boundary. The second thing, what is it? The second thing that makes it so difficult to set boundaries? It's guilt. This relates quite strongly to the first point, but guilt is the idea, and I should say the emotion associated with the feeling that you've done something wrong. And in this case, you've done something wrong by saying no, or that you can't, or you won't do something, or simply you don't want to do something. Guilt about saying no is how people double down on all of this stress. But guilt is one of the strongest glues that keep people in any kind of narcissistic relationship. I feel guilty I didn't visit my mother even though she's always criticizing me. I feel guilty I am not more supportive of my partner. I feel guilty I didn't give my son the ride he asked for. I feel guilty I didn't sign up to do the extra evaluations at work. Guilt is very uncomfortable, and we don't like it. So many times it is easier to give in and do the visit to your mom and have the same time-wasting conversation with your partner, or give your son the ride, or do the extra work, than to set the boundary and endure the discomfort of the guilt. Many of us were taught from an early age by either watching parents in a dysfunctional marriage or just by how your dysfunctional family system worked, that to not go along to get along meant that you were the problem. That setting a boundary was simply not an option. It was highly enmeshed and nobody was setting boundaries. We actually do a terrible job at teaching kids to set boundaries in a healthy manner. Now, obviously, there are some things that they need to do. We all need to do. They need to do their chores. They need to brush their teeth. They need to fulfill their school requirements or make their bed. But go beyond that. Sometimes we force kids to play with kids who make them uncomfortable, or do extra activities like sports that they don't want to play, or instruments that they don't want to learn because the parent wants them to play the sport or be friends with their friend's child. The child may not want these things, and that child may not feel that he or she can say no. If the child finally finds the courage to say no, they will often face a world of guilt and hurt from a narcissistic parent. After all I do for you, you just won't play soccer or spend time with me or spend the entire weekend with the family, even though, of course, the damn family is scapegoating this child. The child doesn't learn boundaries or is guilted for setting them. So you can imagine that association of guilt and boundary will then stream into adulthood. The reason that learning how to set boundaries, especially with manipulative and narcissistic people, I should say, is so difficult, is that you need to learn to get okay with a new kind of discomfort. You need to get okay with possibly not being liked, or maybe being unpopular, or the judgmental scrutiny of other people, or the guilt. Assuming that your boundaries are appropriate, for example, you aren't saying, hey, I'm coming to work, but I'm not going to do what you're paying me to do. Well, obviously that's not going to fly. But assuming that you're setting boundaries in reasonable ways, not taking on extra work you don't have the time for, or going to places where you will be facing criticism or gaslighting, or just not wanting to do something optional because you're exhausted or simply just want to attend to other caregiving duties you have at home, then it's about understanding that setting boundaries sets a tone. The key, and this isn't always possible, especially with parents or siblings or relationships you didn't choose, is to do the boundary setting on the front end. But since most of you watching this are already fully mired in your narcissistic relationships, this becomes about starting to set those boundaries now, today, to start learning to get okay with the discomfort. I gotta tell you, you're choosing between two evils, two difficult situations. But one of them may just be a feeling that you're constructing for yourself, that discomfort, that if I set this boundary, nobody's going to like me. If the people you know or work with or whatever are able to reject you that quickly just for setting a boundary, they really aren't that healthy for you. And in fact, you may be doing the thing that other people are not comfortable doing, which is setting that line. And if they're willing to dump you, well, then they really weren't that in the first place. Boundary setting can also be more difficult if you are not empowered in a given situation. For example, as a function of race, or the amount of money you have, or gender, or some other status that disempowers you. Boundaries are often a privilege of the privileged. But there are a million small ways you can still set them, even if you lack that privilege. Give yourself permission to leave when a conversation becomes taxing, or mentally cut out and go to some happy place in your mind. Use your silence as a boundary. Gray rocking is also a form of boundary. Disengaging is a form of boundary setting. This can be a million small ways that you do this. So I'm well aware when I say, hey everyone, here's a thought for managing a narcissist, just set a boundary, that may very well set off a whole series of uncomfortable psychological experiences for you. It's not as easy as just saying, no, I'm not going to do that. It's a trade-off. But in the long term, getting comfortable with your own discomfort can end up being far better for your mental health than a lifetime of just giving in to entitled and difficult people. Try it in a small way this week. Try one little boundary and see how it works out for you. Again, it's often baby steps. You may have been not able to set boundaries for a lifetime. Rome wasn't built in a day, and you're not going to build huge boundaries in a week, but you can start somewhere. As someone who just had to set a very uncomfortable boundary in the last 48 hours, I got to tell you, that discomfort, it hits your heart. It hits you right here. All those old voices hit you. But if you give yourself a minute, you'll see that the discomfort doesn't kill you. And then there's a new feeling that floods you, which is relief that, oh my goodness, I feel really relieved that I did not agree to do that thing that's just going to leave me feeling resentful and frustrated. So let's face it, everyone in toxic relationships is told one thing: set boundaries, right? In fact, everyone in every relationship is told to set boundaries in all of their relationships, family relationships, intimate relationships, workplaces, relationships, friendships, right? Boundaries is a big issue, right? Boundaries means being clear on issues ranging from time to communication to sex, anything, to give ourselves permission to set a line, to feel safe, and to communicate that line, right? I'm guilty of this, right? It's one of even the elements of healing I put out there is giving the guidance that you should attempt to set boundaries in a narcissistic relationship. In some ways, it's a test. And once you see the narcissistic person will ignore or continue to violate the boundaries, please view that as a bit of a wake-up call. I know that the boundaries won't work, but many people want to rule everything out before they think a toxic relationship is absolutely done. So you set the boundaries. You actually may get stronger. You might get stronger through therapy, maybe because you've been educating yourself about narcissism. Maybe you just get stronger from sheer exasperation, but you get stronger, you follow the guidance, and you really finally do it. You set the boundaries. And then, you know what the narcissist does? They call you controlling. I hear this over and over again from people who attempt to set boundaries in their narcissistic relationships. For years, they didn't set boundaries in these relationships because they were confused, or they blamed themselves, or they did not understand what they were dealing with. Some folks did not set them because they just didn't know how to set them. I mean, let's face it, the vast majority of people are not taught how to set boundaries in childhood. And if you had a narcissistic parent, then forget about it. You were never given permission to set boundaries. And if you did, you would have faced rage and punishment. And if you didn't even get to see boundaries being set, maybe even by your other parent or within the family system, when you didn't see them being enacted, it's hard to do something that you were never taught or that you were never given permission to do. But once you set the boundaries anywhere, it may be directly with the narcissistic person, it may be with someone or something else, and your boundary setting is observed by the narcissistic and by a narcissistic person in your life. But when your boundaries are observed, you setting boundaries is observed by a narcissistic person, they will likely tell you that you're being controlling. And obviously that's a bit of a projection. So let's lay this out as a bit of a scenario, right? You are in a narcissistic relationship. Let's say it's with a parent, right? But you can substitute anyone in there. The parent expects you in a very entitled manner to keep doing things for them as soon as they ask you to do them. It is eating into your time and making your life difficult, and you're very busy. You have tried in gentle and appropriate ways to push them off, tried to get siblings to help, or done what they needed in a rush. But more often than not, you do what they need to get done, but you're getting more resentful. Finally, one day, after taking so much time to do the many frivolous things that the narcissistic parent expects you to do, when they expect you to do them, with little awareness of how this is affecting you, you tell the parent, hey, I can't do this every day. I can do these things like once a week, and that's it. Anything else is going to just have to wait till the next week. And please also don't call me during work hours because it's quite disruptive. And then you do that, good boundaries, and the parent accuses you of being controlling, cold, and maybe even manipulative. It can be quite startling to have someone tell you that you are controlling after years of walking on eggshells and then finally making clear what you would think would be clear to any self aware person. But there's the rub. They aren't self aware. That's the issue. You, me, all of us, we all exist at their need and at their whim. They are delusional enough to think that we are the problem, that they are always right, and that we have no right to set a boundary. And if we are, then we're being controlling. Narcissistic people pathologize and shame qualities in others, which make their lives more difficult or pick away at their sense of grandiosity and entitlement. If they are the greatest and all powerful, well, then how could somebody actually set boundaries on them? I mean, nobody sets boundaries with the king, right? If you from an early age saw the message that setting boundaries was a bad thing, and then attempted to set boundaries, and are then told that you are being controlling, it can discourage you from wanting to set them or from setting them at all. Narcissistic people find that shaming and calling you crazy works. And these comments often will stop you from engaging in the behavior that's inconveniencing them. So it's a really, really clever manipulation, isn't it? Setting boundaries with narcissistic folks will not result in them changing their behavior or honoring the boundaries, but it will perhaps result in you opening your eyes wider to what you're seeing. I know that some people don't set them because they are afraid of the narcissistic person's rage, or they are afraid of losing the narcissistic person from their life. The narcissistic relationship is often about all of us holding back because we are afraid they will disappear if we ask too much or set a boundary. That is your work because this is an unhealthy space. And for all of us to work on unpacking our trauma bonds to help diminish the power of the narcissistic folks in our lives. As a result, many people in narcissistic relationships, often in order to survive, will find themselves immersed in denial. By not setting boundaries, you don't then have to see how bad the narcissistic relationship is. But once you do set the boundary and witness their reaction, it's a painful and stark reminder of how dysfunctional the relationship is. It can be easier to not set the boundaries at all and remain in denial. Because once you set the boundaries and see what it really is about, the grief can be overwhelming. But that, in the long run, is not good for you. So with boundary setting, start small. Start practicing boundary setting with the healthier people in your life who will be willing to respect the boundaries, and then start building up those boundaries in other areas. It can be painful to witness what happens in the relationships when you do set boundaries. But even if you stay, at least you will do so with your eyes wide open and not believing that this is going to change. And no, setting an appropriate boundary is not controlling, no matter what they say to you. We're back to our proverb series, and today's proverb is, "He who sups with the devil should have a long spoon." Ever hear that? Well, before we get to that, and also, if you're new to this channel, please subscribe and join this magnificent community of followers. But let's take on this proverb. He who sups with the devil should have a long spoon. Now, again, like I said, more and more of the proverbs are being sent in by all of you. And you know how what I love about the proverb series is some of them are on point. Some of them are actually bad guidance. This one happens to be on point. This line, about long spoons and devils originated from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. I guess Chaucer knew something about boundaries, because that's really what this is about. The meaning of this proverb is pretty clear. If you're going to fraternize and spend time with bad people, you want to be able to keep your distance and not get too close. So, really, it's about boundaries and realistic expectations. It begs the question of whether a person can keep narcissistic people in their lives by just keeping them at a distance. And I would argue that the answer to that question is yes. Now, as an exercise, I want you to take a minute, pause this video, and jot down a list of the narcissistic people in your life. Think about how many of these where you might actually be able to have a mildly functional relationship if you just don't have to rely on them. You can just get what you need and get out and don't personalize what they say and do. Obviously, a spouse or a partner or a friend may not qualify because you need them. But there are, in fact, other less impactful narcissistic people in your life. We all have them. I did this exercise and I recognize that there are these kinds of narcissistic folks in my life where I can see what they are and what they are about and need them professionally or for some other reason, or it would disrupt other very important relationships in my life if I blew up the relationships with these narcissists. So I don't ever let them get too close to me. I never share anything with them about myself. I do not share my vulnerabilities with them. I get in, I get out, and it's done. So pause the video and make a note of those folks, and then you can restart and get to the rest of this video. Because that's the long spoon. There are too many narcissistic folks in the world out there for any of us to realistically live a narcissist-free life. Unless you are able to stay locked in your house with a nice pet and have a few friends and don't meet their friends and don't have to work or go to the store ever, then perhaps. But the rest of us are having to sometimes sup with the devil, and we need long spoons. The key is to identify the toxic patterns as early as possible. The earlier you identify them, the better you can start taking out your long spoon. You can keep it tight and then not spin off into something deeper with them. You can pay attention to any trauma-bonded patterns like justification or trying harder to win them over. You keep that long spoon with you at all times, so when you do have to sup with them, you can keep things in a way so they don't do harm through their invalidation and their gaslighting. Now, this comes in most handy in the workplace. The ability to sup with the devil using that long spoon may be the only way that people may survive most narcissistic workplaces. Now, I got to tell you, I have yet to see a narcissist-free workplace in any place with more than a few employees. So it's about figuring out who the players are and how not to get burned, how to remain politic and get your needs met, but not get played. It does mean coming into situations in a rather cynical manner, having to assess people and situations and watch them carefully, and maybe shorten your spoon a little as trust is built, but you can do that cautiously. I find that when supping with the devil, that supping with a long spoon can work. Part of the trick is to avoid any optional conversation or activity, particularly in the workplace. The meeting is done. You don't get sucked into idle chit-chat. You don't fall into the gossip swamp. You don't share secrets on a business trip. You definitely avoid happy hour, and you keep it tight at workplace social events. Forgive my language here, but don't shit where you eat. Now, another place that supping with a long spoon comes in handy is when you meet friends of friends or partners or friends of a partner or friends of a family. You may like the friend or the partner or the family member, but they may bring you into proximity of some toxic people. Again, you always need to keep that long spoon and not fall for the idea like, well, I really love my friend, so their friend must be cool. Nope. In the narcissistic world we live in now, you have to be on your toes for a while until you slowly build trust. It's an exhausting way to live, but such is the world we live in. Because narcissism seems to be creeping into so many areas of our lives, we need tools to find a way to coexist with the toxic people in our midst. It's naive to think you can eliminate all of them. Things like boundaries, taking our time to get to know someone and not doubting our instincts, heeding the red flags, and obviously carrying long spoons. We can't live in a narcissist-free world, but we can find workarounds and ways of protecting ourselves, and always keep a few of those long spoons in your back pocket. Thanks again, and please keep sending in those proverbs. They're great. I love reading them, and as you can see, one after the other, they're turning into some really great content. 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 Really great content.